Inventing Reality. Section: The Limits of Orthodoxy. If the mass media are owned by capitalists who can translate their financial dominance into control over media content, injecting that content with a bias against organized labor, anti-war protesters, socialists, communists, and sundry progressive causes, then why do business people and conservatives repeatedly complain that the media suffers from a liberal bias? If economic and political elites control the press, why are they often distrustful of and irritated by what appears in it? And why do they find it necessary to exert suppressive measures against their own media? There are a number of contradictory tendencies that make the press less than absolutely compliant, introducing an element of indeterminacy and resistance that rouses conservative ire. First, one reason deviancy occasionally peeks through an otherwise orthodox mainstream press is that ideological control is not formal and overt, but informal and implicit. Therefore, it will work with imperfect effect. Dissenting information will sometimes slip through. For example, one evening in January 1985 on the NBC Evening News, Tom Brokaw noted quickly, almost furtively, that corporations are today paying a substantially smaller portion of the nation's income tax than 5 years ago. No elaboration, no pie charts, just a two-line news item that seemed to have been slipped in. A one-shot coverage, never to be discussed further. Similarly, the print media sometimes carry revealing items, buried in otherwise standard stories. Exceptional things that are likely to go unnoticed, except to the closely critical reader, because of their poor placement and lack of projective framing. The presence of such nuggets scattered here and there in the mountains of dross is what enables critics of capitalism occasionally to draw damaging information from the capitalist media itself. When detected as deviancies, these items are usually suppressed. A staff member of a local early morning radio news program in Washington, D.C. pointed out to me, quote, "Sometimes the 7 o'clock morning edition will carry an item or two that has some real zip. These run because the station manager hasn't arrived yet. They're cut out of the 8 o'clock edition because by then he's at his post. I wouldn't say it's a regular occurrence, but it happens once in a while." End quote. Second, sometimes editors run stories because they are unable to foresee their troublesome implications and unintended spin-offs. While the "blame the journalist" critics argue that distortions are caused by inadequate information and hasty preparation, I am suggesting there are times when haste and low information levels lead to greater revelations than would normally be allowed were reporters and editors better apprised of a story's potentially discordant ideological effects. Even the best informed news people cannot always anticipate the effects of their stories. A report on how a particular corporation is taking care of a toxic spill may be intended to show the firm's socially responsible behavior and reassure the public, whereas it actually has the unintended but more accurate effect of revealing how big companies are poisoning the environment. Early news reports, 1980 to 81, planted by the U.S. government about the growing effectiveness of guerrilla forces in El Salvador, while intending to alert the public to the emergence of a new communist menace, had the unintended effect of activating an anti-interventionist peace movement in the United States, causing officials in the Reagan administration to request that the press not give so much attention to the war in El Salvador. Third, serious differences sometimes arise among politico-economic elites on how best to advance their common class interests. These differences will be reflected in the news media. Thus, while remaining supportive of the president's jingoistic approach to the Gulf crisis of 1991, The press gave space and time to such elite critics such as former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who called for a reliance on sanctions. To the extent such differences among elites are played out in the media, they add to the appearance and substance of diversity, if not on fundamental questions, then on tactical ones. Fourth, when the press has an enduring interest in an issue, it is likely to be less compliant than usual, as with the question of protecting the confidentiality of its sources. If reporters are unable to guarantee confidentiality, they run the risk of having their sources dry up. Another area of conflict between state and press arises when reporters are victimized by state violence. Reports of widespread brutality by police, army, and federal marshals against anti-war participants in the 1960s were so thoroughly suppressed by the major news organizations that on one occasion protesters had to buy a page in the New York Times, which they filled with eyewitness accounts of violent mistreatment by authorities. But the police riot against anti-war demonstrators in Chicago during the 1968 Democratic National Convention did make the news in a big way, mostly because of the deliberate acts of police violence against members of the press. Likewise, the mass execution of young Nicaraguan males by Somoza's National Guard during the last days of his rule received little, if any, notice in the U.S. media until ABC's Bill Stewart was executed by guardsmen while covering the Nicaragua uprising. In the days that followed, the film of Stewart's execution, taken by an American camera person standing a distance away, was played repeatedly on network news. And for the first time, the American press also began mentioning that young Nicaraguans were being systematically murdered by the Guard. The killing of foreign news people, as opposed to American journalists, is less likely to be accorded elaborate treatment. During the 1980s, scores of foreign journalists were murdered or, quote, disappeared in Central America, but there was no discernible outcry in the American press. Had they been killed by leftist insurgents, they might have got more coverage. Fifth, journalists who believe they are autonomous professionals expect to be able to report things as they see them. If the appearance of journalistic independence is violated too often and too blatantly by superiors, this can have a demystifying effect, reminding the staff that they are not working in a democratic institution, but one controlled from the top, with no regard for professional standards as they understand them. To avoid being criticized as censors and intrusive autocrats, publishers and network bosses sometimes grant their news organizations some modicum of independence, relying on hiring, firing, and promotional policies, and more indirect controls. They might show themselves willing to make an occasional concession, so as to minimize the amount of overt intrusion. The idea of a free press is more a myth than a reality, but myths can have an effect on things and can serve as a resource of power. The power of a legitimating myth rests on its ability to be believed and not exposed as a sham. So at times, superiors can be prevailed upon to make concessions. To offer an instance, after a year of unremittingly hostile reports about the leftist armed forces movement in Portugal, the New York Times agreed to run a guest opinion column by me that offered a more sympathetic view of the struggle in that country. The day before the column was to appear, top editor Abe Rosenthal intervened to suppress it. My inquiries brought only evasive responses from the opinion page editors who had accepted the piece. Only after 3 months of telephone calls from me, reminding the Times editors that they were under an obligation to give their readers a glimpse of the other side. And after 2 updated rewrites by me, did the Times print it. The only 800 words the newspaper ever ran that contradicted the thousands of column inches that echoed the White House line. Somehow, I had prevailed upon the opinion page editor, who had prevailed upon Rosenthal. Even then, the piece appeared only after Portugal had dropped from the news and was once more safely in the Western capitalist camp. And lest the Times readers be unduly swayed, my guest column was accompanied by a hostile editorial denouncing the left in Portugal and calling for support of conservative, quote, pluralistic forces. So on infrequent occasions, in limited, lopsided ways, the legitimating myth of, quote, allowing both sides a hearing can be used by dissenters to drive a wedge into a monopoly press that finds it difficult to practice within its own ranks the pluralism it so vigorously preaches to the world. The press is not totally immune to the pressures of those who struggle for a more egalitarian and peaceable world. It must make some adjustment to democratic forces, as when the emergence of independent nations in Africa and Asia induces it to discard some of its more blatant colonialist, racist stereotypes. The emergence of the civil rights movement in the United States, which won the sympathy and support of large sectors of the public, brought dramatic shifts in media coverage of the struggle for racial equality, and of African American people in general, although it hardly ended racist reporting and stereotyping. Similarly, as opinion turned with increasing militancy against the Vietnam War, the press began to entertain criticisms about the feasibility, but not the morality, of the war. Quote, as the ruling class media brass and their advertisers began to realize that no amount of lying or propaganda could turn defeat into victory, end quote, and as they witnessed how the Vietnam conflict was causing a crisis within the United States, quote continued, media coverage began to shift, giving more prominence to those who called for a saner outlook, end quote. The greater the opposition is believed to be toward a leader or a policy, observed Pallitz and Entman, quote, the more emboldened network correspondents are in their analysis. The enthusiastic reception Soviet leader Khrushchev won from the American public when he visited the United States in 1959 favorably influenced the kind of media coverage accorded him. Likewise, as opinion turned against President Nixon during the Watergate scandal, the press delivered negative judgments upon him, quote, but only then, with his prestige and power in dramatic decline, and his attempts at media manipulation more transparent than ever, end quote, for it was then safe to do so. Aware that active segments of the public are mobilized around an issue, the media must take account of that agitation, even if only to devalue it and minimize it, as with most protest movements. Yet even in the course of doing this, the press ends up acknowledging, in some limited way, the existence of popular sentiments and mass movements. To add to the appearance of free and diverse discourse, the press allots a small portion of its time and space to the public itself. Radio call-in shows enable us to hear directly from listeners and provide opportunities for the brief airing of dissident viewpoints. Many of these talk shows, when running at prime time, are dominated by right-wing hosts or mainstream centrists who show only a limited tolerance toward leftist call-ins. Some shows quote from the letters of listeners and viewers, little of which deviates markedly from the standard opinion range. There are also guest opinion pieces by readers, and of course the letter to the editor column found in many publications. Such meager accommodations are designed to create the impression of an open, untrammeled communication between media and public where one does not exist. Furthermore, the letter columns and call-in shows provide as much opportunity for conventional, conservative, and ill-informed views as for any other. Yet they offer openings that progressive persons have sometimes utilized with effect. Even the letters that are not printed do get read and play a small part in pressuring the press. End section.